So I'm Rebecca Snyder from the MDDC Press Association. We're here today with Danielle Ohl, now of PA Spotlight, formerly and always in her heart of the Capital Gazette. And she'll be talking to us about some of the challenges and some of the successes in working with public records in reporting. This is a pretty interactive session, so feel free to jump in with questions and comments. We've got a lot of expertise in the proverbial room, so I hope that we can all learn from one another. Danielle, you have a really long history of working with public records in some work with ProPublica, as well as in a variety of beats and settings. So I will turn it over to you and let you run with it.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am excited to chat with you all. I think that I can learn some things from you guys. So I am going to share my screen and then you guys tell me if it's working. And okay. Is that working? Okay, great.
Yes.
Hold on. Let me just minimize. As I told Rebecca earlier, our house cat is currently trying to claw her way under the door. So, you know, if you hear that, that's what that is. Okay, yeah, so I am gonna try to keep this pretty short because I think that, you know, I wanna make sure that we have time for like dialogue and discussion, but I'll keep your challenges in mind as I go through. So, you know, as Rebecca said, I'm Danielle Ohl, formerly of the Capital Gazette in Annapolis. I start at Spotlight, PA in 2 weeks. So I am going to be out of the MDDC family, but, you know, still have, I think, some relevant knowledge to share. So I'm just going to go through like a few tips that I kind of are my like, you know, are my standbys every time that I go into reporting and want a public record. So I think that one of you mentioned this, but the thing that is so important is to not just, you know, if you're starting a story and you're like, okay, I need some emails or I need you know, some business records or some kind of document that isn't immediately available, although we'd all love them to be. There is sometimes an instinct to just like take to your, you know, your document and pop up a form letter and throw something in there kind of blind and then send it off to get the process started. But I really find that the number one thing that helps the most is to actually talk to a human about it first, whether that's the custodian or just a source that you have in the relevant department. It really helps to kind of ask people, hey, this thing that I'm thinking that I want, does it exist? Does that make sense? If you were asking for it, how would you go about that? And that gives you more of a sense of whether you are, you know, starting down a path that's worthwhile. Because like a couple of you mentioned, you know, this process can be quite long and annoying. So you want to make sure that you're not kind of going on a wild goose chase and then ending up with something that you don't want. And then related very closely to that, and probably the most important thing I would recommend, is to understand the system that you are about to, you know, inquiry about. So whether that's, you know, the city council and whether they all have email addresses, whether they use their Gmails, because, you know, some city councils do. If it's, you know, the school board, do they have minutes? How are those stored? Do they regularly take attendance? Are those attendance sheets, are they stored in any kind of way? You know, or if it's a bigger agency like a state agency and you are looking for something really specific about, you know, a grant program, who is the person that, oh, I think we have somebody else joining. Who is the person that is like not the director of the, you know, the whole department or the whole cabinet level, you know, position, but the person who's overseeing the grant program. Talk to them, make sure that you know, okay, so are there applications? How many things are, cities, nonprofits, how many, what do they have to submit? Are they required to send reports if they get a grant? These are the kinds of things that you want to make sure you really, really understand. So, I mean, you basically have to do reporting, right? Like we all, but you got to do reporting even on your public records requests to make sure that they are really serving you in the best way possible. Oh, why won't it let me? Okay. The next one is read the law. That seems really obvious, but I think that you are in the best position possible when you understand the law better than the people who you're working with. Which is often, honestly, as journalists, I'm sure you guys know, the PIOs sometimes are just people who got slotted into the position because, the former person left or they're the only one. It's a small department and they have 7 different jobs. So sometimes those people don't really know, the Maryland Public Information Act or whatever it's called in Delaware and DC. And you got to make it your job to know it better than they do. I find this is particularly helpful with laws outside of public records laws, such as the dreaded HIPAA. You will, I'm sure you have encountered HIPAA as something that obstructs you from everything from asking for coronavirus numbers to asking about like who took sick time in the government, in the local government. And it's important that you understand what HIPAA is, what any law is that someone's going to throw up at you, because usually they don't. And you can kind of like work your way through it if they throw it up. And for instance, I did a story about, the rate of vaccination among Anne Arundel County's public safety organizations. So police, fire, EMT. And like 3 of the 4 departments gave it to me. And then I got to one of them, I think it was the Annapolis Police. And they told me, oh, we can't tell you how many people have been vaccinated. And I said, why? And they said, oh, because of HIPAA. They didn't even spell it right. They're just like, oh, because of HIPAA. And so I have at the ready, a form letter kind of thing that says, okay, like this is what HIPAA is. This is what it says about, local government and information sharing. HIPAA actually does encourage in the text of the law organizations to be open if they can be. So, what's the deal here? And I didn't even get a response to that. I just got the records that I wanted. It was like, oh, never mind, here you go. So, it can help you to know the law better than the people you're dealing with. This one I'm going to tell you as advice, but I'm also going to reveal that I have difficulty with it. But it's really helpful to be organized first. Like when you are working in a daily newsroom, like a lot of you guys are, it's difficult to keep track of all the different things, all the different stories and tips and records requests that you have going at the same time. And I do recommend that you have, a couple going because they do take a long time. So, as you're going about your daily reporting, your records request might be chugging through the system. I use a spreadsheet, basically has a couple different columns, what the request is, who I sent it to, when was the last time I talked to them, what was the last update I got. And that helps because then I can pop that up at the beginning of my week and say, oh shoot, I really haven't looked at this. I haven't talked to them about this records request in a couple of weeks. I should circle back on that. And then, sorry, Phil just texted me. I'm going to call you out, Phil. It is not a HIPAA violation to discuss your lack of organization. And along with being organized, you have to be persistent. I know it feels a little weird sometimes. It feels like you're being annoying, but it is the person that you're dealing with, it is their job to follow the law. And the law says that you have a right to a timely process. You don't always get one, but you ostensibly have the right to one. So be persistent, but be nice. There is nothing gained by being rude. If anything, that they're gonna, make your life more difficult if you are really surly and aggressive. So, just be as polite as you possibly can be. I know it's frustrating, but you do kind of get more progress that way, I find, than, kind of barging in there with sharp elbows. And then the last tip is use the records when you get them. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a huge cache of records and gone about my daily reporting life and just not gotten to going through them. You don't want to go through this entire process and fight just to not use something, because you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know is probably in those records. So I do really recommend setting aside time, telling your editor, hey, I got this, because editors love to hear that you got something that somebody else doesn't have. Make the time, and it'll be worth it. And I just quickly have a little case study to kind of put all of these things together that I'll walk you guys through, and then we can just open it up to chat. So let me see, how do I do this? Okay, how do I, new share, let's see. Okay.
Technology is always our Achilles heel. While Danielle's, so actually I think Danielle, you would stop sharing this and then you share again.
I see, okay.
And just for everyone else in the chat, I put the links for Maryland, Delaware, and DC FOIA. I'll quick pull Virginia's FOIA website so that everyone can have the law at their fingertips. So.
Yeah. And yeah, if your attorney general has a guidebook of how to interpret the law, that's also something to just have on hand. Maryland has a great one. Okay. All right, I'm going to share again.
And we'll get into a little bit later. I can share also some of the changes that will be coming up to Maryland's law. They won't take effect until next year, so I don't want to get everyone's hopes up that right now, but there's some new enforcement and dispute resolution aspects, which hopefully will help, but it is a long and arduous process.
It is. Okay, so I'm going to share again. And here we go. All right. So many of you guys will be familiar with this screen. This is, if you're not, this is a search result for the Maryland Judiciary Case Search. It's where you can find criminal, civil, anything in between records that go through the court system. And this speaks to a process that I went through last year, I guess 18 months ago, when I was doing an investigation for ProPublica's local reporting network. I was investigating the local housing authority, and I know that I knew I needed to see the full scope of their lawsuits, basically, against residents. So when residents, quote unquote, failed to pay, they would file a lawsuit. That's what the whole story was about. And the housing authority claimed that they did not keep records of who they sued and when. So I was like, okay, let me turn to the court system. So I think that what is important to know is when there is something like this, when there is some sort of record available online, you want to make sure that you're looking at it and you're looking at what it tells you about what there might be waiting behind that, or what more there might be. So this is a database, right? This thing that you see here, this is, the housing authorities civil cases filed over the last couple years, and it looks like somebody needs to follow up since I did my reporting because they're filing again. This is a database which tells me that when I am putting in this query that you see up here, that is searching something on the back end, right? That is bigger than what I'm being delivered here. So that's how I knew. And then in talking with, that's how I knew that there was something more that I could ask for. And in talking with their communications department, I talked to their IT specialist, asked, how do you catalog these things? Are they all available? Do you digitize them? And that is how I was able to kind of put together a request for a database. The other thing that was important to do was, let's see, is this the one? Okay, it's not gonna, there we go. I made sure to go to court. Sometimes it does take a little bit of legwork, literal legwork. Go to court and pull one of those records that came up in the case search and really familiarize myself with, what they look like, what is the information that I'm getting, so that when I asked for the database, I knew what the fields that would be in there would be. So like, here is, person being sued. Here is their address. Here are the date and time. Here's the amount. And I was able to ask, are these things all things that get input into your system, which do, which don't? Because usually if you have a document that has, it's a standardized document where people put in information, it gets turned into a field. So like, a name can be a field, an address can be a field, a month, a money amount. And that's kind of what I mean about like understanding the system is, I spent a lot of time talking with people about not only how these records are stored, but how the like landlord tenant court works in Maryland. And I'll stop sharing. Because it was, important that I understood that, okay, there is a huge volume of these documents coming in every day because there is not a lot of requirement in Maryland law before you can file one. I mean, there's, this is one of the few states in the country that doesn't require any notice before filing a lawsuit for rent. So that meant that there was a really big volume. That meant that there was really big backlog. That meant that, not everything that existed in the universe of these cases actually showed up on case search. So it was important that I asked for the documents that were on the back end that were in the internal storage, because then I had a better idea than I could even get from case search of, how many lawsuits the housing authority had filed against its tenants. And I was persistent on that. It took a while. The court tried to pretend that they didn't understand really what I was asking for. They were like, well, you can't have access to our database. I'm like, I don't want access to your database. I just want you to export, a piece of it. But I was able to finally do that. And the nice thing about it was not only did I have, a whole basically like address book to work off of people who had been affected by this issue, but the court was familiar with me. They were familiar with this process. So I was able to do it again and again. As I took over reporting on the pandemic and wanted to keep track of how landlords were filing cases against their tenants during eviction moratoriums. Or moratoria. So that's just one case. It was a pretty kind of extreme one. It took a long time, but this is a process that I think is pretty effective. I'm not going to say it's foolproof because there are those exemptions that that sometimes you can't surmount, but it has definitely worked in my favor more times than not. So yeah, appreciate you guys listening to me, and I guess let's just open it up for discussion.
All right, what questions do you have for Danielle? I mean, some of it, it struck me, Danielle, in your most recent reporting, it kind of got into you're not quite, people were asking, like, they weren't quite sure what even to ask for. And so it sounded like what you did was just kind of dive in to be like, this is the topic that I'm interested in. There has to be a paper trail somewhere. Let me see what's available. Is that your strategy?
Yeah, so yes, it is. And I would say, if there is some sort of resource online, like a case search, or even like, any PDFs that get uploaded to your local government's website. Like, let's say you're looking into violations, violations of developers, right? They're like flouting the local environmental protection guidance. There's a big issue with one like bad developer, but you want to see how common this is. Cities and counties and states all have tons of forms, right, that you have to fill out if you want a permit or if you want this or that. So they have laws, right, and when I say be familiar with the law, like be familiar with the law that governs the thing that you're investigating too, because it'll give you clues as to what the paper trail is, exactly what it is that the government is receiving and giving back, because they can't do anything until they get the information from the person, the organization, and then they give it back. So it might be that there's an application for a permit, there's a permit that goes out, then there's a violation that gets sent back, there's an appeal. All of that creates a paper trail. For this, this started with just a source of mine telling me that she got sued by the housing authority, and particularly oddly, she was being accused of fraud. So I did, pop into case search, okay, like housing authority of the city of Annapolis. And I saw all these records pop up, that ones that I showed you in the previous screen. And I knew I didn't quite understand it, right? Like I wasn't sure what it meant that there were so many. But I set about, figuring it out. Like I went to court, I talked to the clerks. I was like, okay, what is, failure to pay? How do they file, when landlords want to file a suit against a tenant, how does that work? Do they just hand it to you? Do they upload it themselves? And that starts to inform you as to, what is out there, and how broad you have to be, right? Like if you are thinking that there's only one specific document that you need, then you can ask them about it. Just, I'm looking for this thing from, this person got sued, or this landlord is doing the suing. Or if you want more broadly, you're like, okay, I want to look at all the landlords that filed during a specific month, or just during a specific year period of time, like when the CARES Act eviction moratorium was in place. That, like, you have just think about what it is that you're investigating, what it is that you're reporting on, and what will best answer your questions. And I think that is a good place to start from.
So it sounds like a lot of, like, even non-journalist questions, just like understanding, okay, if I were a developer and I wanted to do something, like, what do I need to do?
Yeah, exactly.
To learn that process.
Yeah, it's a lot. It sounds kind of trite, but it's like, yeah, just like if you were just a regular old citizen asking for this thing, or, going to the MVA and applying for a certain permit, or, a license, like what would you do? What are the forms? And you can ask for blank forms, like, any kind of blank form that's out there. They might not, and that is one way that I've found is helpful to kind of thwart some of the exemptions. It's like they might tell you that they can't give you the data or the records because they have private information, or they're deliberative or whatever. But you can ask for the blank forms. You can even ask for, I'm recently asked the state for a database of vaccine spoilage incidents. So like wasting vaccines, they're not, they're no longer good, they broke, whatever. And they told me they couldn't give that to me. And I actually went to mediation on it. And the mediator was like, okay, well, they're willing to give you a database, but it's not going to have everything. And I was like, just give me a blank database, because that'll tell me what it is that they're tracking, what are the different columns and how many rows there are, right? And then you count the rows, even though they're blank, and then you know how many spoilage incidents there were. So even, it might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but like, no information can be information.
That's so meta.
It is, but like even if they're going to send you pages of redacted stuff, like just pages of black, it's important to know how many pages there are, right? It's important to know that they redacted all of it, because then you could also just write about that, and usually that helps pry some stuff loose too, because they don't like to be seen as like shady.
Right. So I have tons more questions, but I don't want to hog Danielle's time and resources. So what other things did you all want to know or have questions about, or experiences? No one? No one? Oh, Madeline. Maddie, you're now off mute. Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, Danielle, can you talk me through the mediation process, or like how you go about appealing if like someone's legally in the wrong and they're just not giving you the document? Like, how does that work? I've really struggled to understand that.
Yeah, so it's not great, but I will tell you how it works. So you file your records request, the agency gets back to you and they say no for this, and this reason, and you go back to them. And and that's another thing I should have said, like, don't take the first no as an answer, because it's very rarely the final answer. So they come back to you, they say no for these reasons. You say, okay, but like, I read this law that you're citing and this is about this, and I'm asking about this. And they say, well, no, we still are, you come to an impasse, you go back and forth a few times and it's not working. There is an ombudsman for Maryland who's specifically tasked with overseeing the open meetings and open records laws. Her name is Linda Kirshner. She's very overworked. Basically, you put a request in with
Lisa.
Oh, Lisa, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian. Thank you. Lisa Kirshner. You put a request in with her office, and they basically go to the agency. They say, hey, we have some questions based on what Danielle has told us. Can you talk us through what your problem is? She comes back to me and says, this is what they said. They're willing to do this. Does that work? And that's kind of it. And like, Lisa will tell you that she is, your request isn't her only request. She can only do so much, because it's basically just her. So she doesn't have a lot of resources. And even if the mediation process doesn't go your way, that's kind of the only thing that you can do after that is go to the courts, which you might not have the time or money or energy. So I do recommend, unless it's like really serious and your newsroom is willing to get behind you and like throw a legal battle, I would say the talk to a human thing up front is gonna like do a lot of work toward getting you at least to an answer that is somewhat, sometimes it's not satisfactory, like, I'll be perfectly honest, but I think that it is worthwhile to kind of talk to somebody and be like, this is what I'm looking for. I know you're going to hit me with deliberative, or personnel is my favorite, but like, what else is there? Like, what do you guys do? What documents are there on this issue? Talk me through how it works. And they might tell you something that you didn't know about. So, I mean, I know that's not the best, Maddie. I wish I were like, oh yeah, there's this wonderful process, but Maryland, it just kind of sucks. But
Well, the good news is that Pennsylvania has like a pretty, at least clear one, and like you can go through and appeal, and like there's a very specific process that's really easy to understand. So good luck with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you do your thing, you go to the ombudsman, and if that doesn't work, then you go to the courts. There is and some of the others can back me up if I'm wrong or correct me. There is like a compliance board, but they have no power. There's no teeth.
So here's where I feel like I want to jump in and talk a little bit about the changes that are coming.
Yeah, definitely do, because I don't know about them.
Yeah, so and in the chat I put in Lisa's request for mediation form, so that's handy. And then she's done some really good blog posts about the law that was passed this past session. That's House Bill 183. It's been enrolled. The changes will occur July 1st, 2022. And I also want to divert just a smidge and say that, of course, every state is different with its open records law. So, if we feel like Maryland is kind of sad, go to Delaware and feel just a little bit gloomier. So everybody's different. But the changes, Danielle is totally right. The ombudsman has only the power to mediate. She cannot compel. She cannot. Oh, and I see Brian has a hand up. Did you want to talk about the changes or experience now, Brian?
No, good. I thought when we reached an appropriate time, I might throw a couple of tips that I've picked up along the way that might help folks. But I was trying to find a way to do it without interrupting your flow, and what I completely did was derail you.
Oh, don't worry. I'm used to it. So, all right, I'll quick do that, and then we'll go to Brian with some tips and tricks, which will be very helpful. So the changes, as Danielle said, the ombudsman does not have a power to compel a custodian to turn over records. The PIA Compliance Board, which is separate from the Open Meetings Compliance Board, they're two different acts. They can only adjudicate or mediate or provide resolution to disputes about fees that are $350 or over. So they have an extraordinarily narrow jurisdiction currently. What House Bill 183 has done is wildly expand the jurisdiction of the PIA Compliance Board, so they are able to compel and create binding resolution to disputes on pretty much everything. There are some sort of ways that it's a little bit narrowed, primarily because the University of Maryland system was not in favor at all of these changes. They were worried that if there was an alternative dispute resolution aspect, that we would have that the floodgates would open and they would just be overwhelmed. So that's why it has been pushed back a little bit. And then, of course, in the past session, records related to police misconduct are now no longer classified as personnel records. So that's also a huge step forward. All these things, I think there's 26 exemptions under the Maryland law. So there's always something that can be pulled out, whether it's deliberative or investigatory or whatnot. So, but know that there is a stronger way for dispute resolution, so it's not just the court systems. And you can read more about that in the chat. Brian, you want to tell us a little bit more about your experiences and tips?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of quick things. I mean, one of the things that I thought was particularly helpful that Danielle brought up was talking to real people. And a lot of times it's an undervalued opportunity to actually go physically into a government office and walk up to a clerk and just ask for something. You have to remember that a lot of times these are people who are just trying to keep their jobs and feed their families, and maybe they've been told there's a limit to what they can give out, but I find that going in and asking for it helps. I also like to ask for blank forms. I ask for blank forms a lot because there's nothing on a blank form that has to be redacted. I just want to see what kind of information you're collecting. Plus, it also gives me an idea of what the document is actually called. You know, a lot of times these government forms have these stupid little numbers and things on the bottom. And, you know, so I collect blank forms and ask for them all the time. And again, there's no reason to hold anybody up for 30 days to get a blank form because you're not asking for anything that should have to be redacted. I've had some success writing about when government agencies have jammed me up. One of the ones that jumps to mind, and you can actually find a story that I wrote about this. I blogged for a different publication. I blogged for 38 days, every day for 38 days, about the Baltimore County school system jamming me up on a contract for a deputy superintendent. And ultimately wrote one of my blog posts that really picked up some attention was one that I think was called the weather forecast in hell, and where I was literally told by the PIO that it would be a cold day in hell before I would get it if I didn't file an actual physical request for. I wasn't even asking for a document. I just wanted her to tell me how much the superintendent was making, which is a really interesting thing. Like, Public Information Act requests do not cover questions. And so, you know, don't file one for a question, but also, you know, don't respond to somebody that says, well, you know, you're asking for this salary, you have to file this request. And if you Google this and find the piece, you will find some of the really stupid things that this PIO said to me in trying to deny me access to the record. So if you work for a publication that will allow you to do it, sometimes in extreme cases, it works. And I will tell you that ultimately what happened in that case was a special assistant to the superintendent for Baltimore County Public Schools, who used to work for Dutch Rupersberger, was a guy I'd known for a long time, who finally called me and said, Jesus, Brian, what do we have to do to make this go away? And I said, Bob, just give me the number. And he looked at me, he was kind of puzzled, and he said, that's it? And I told him, and he said, well, meet me for lunch at the Towson Diner. And I went and had lunch with him, and he literally wrote it on a napkin and slid it across the desk at me and was like, he's like, make this go away, you know, and so, you know, sometimes it's just as easy as that, you know, writing about it and putting pressure on them. You know, the other thing is that, sometimes be prepared to push a little bit, to perhaps battle. I've gotten some weird attempts to stop me from getting something based on fees. At one point in Baltimore County, they wanted to charge me a fee for a computer person to pull the records, and it turned out when you worked out the hourly fee, what this person would have been making was about $170,000 a year. So I immediately turned around, pulled out my budget, found out that this was an exorbitant amount of money based on the salary. So I filed a request for the salaries of all of their computer people making $170,000 a year. At which point they had to acknowledge they didn't have any. And they kept sort of like revising the fee. And then they wanted to charge me, we got down to $50. They wanted to charge me $50 for a CD to put the information on. And I wrote back and I said, this is ridiculous. I could drive your guy down to Best Buy and buy a spindle of your fanciest CDs for under $20, and I'll give them all to you. I just want one back with the data on it. And finally, they wrote back and said, you know, after 3 days of back and forth, basically wrote back and said, how about if we just email it to you? You know, that kind of thing where, you know, like I literally just had to like keep fighting. I mean, so don't be afraid to kind of push back. The other thing I always do is I'll ask if there's any reason why they can't just release something to me. And I had some success last week with a record for a public official and ethics filing that these are not put online. And I was willing, I didn't understand the process for how to get it, but I was willing to go and get it. And finally, after a little bit of negotiation and some pushing and a little bit of cajoling, what I ended up getting was 5 years of this record just emailed to me, because I said finally, you know, like could you just, is it possible for you to just email it to me? And the guy finally just sent it to me. So sometimes just sort of asking and keeping at it, you can get a couple of these things that you want. But don't take no as your first answer. And if fees look weird, they probably are weird. They're meant to stop you. And don't be afraid to sit down and do the math and figure out what they're really trying to charge you, and then dig in on that story. Because typically, if they figure out that you're going to write about something like that, they would rather not be embarrassed by it and figure out a way to just sort of get you the record. Also, don't pay $50 for a CD.
Excellent advice. Never pay $50 for a CD. As we wind up, I know it's 10:23. Are there any questions, tips that you want to bring to the group? Anything we can help or share? Go for it, Maddie.
I do have another question, but I don't want to prevent anyone else from asking. So somebody just interrupt me. So this is maybe a question for the room, and it's more about court records than like agency public records. But I really want to do a deep dive into an old homicide case, and I want the entire file. I want the whole thing. I want someone to just hand me a big stack of papers. Like, is that just clerk's office? Is there any different process that I need to go through for getting the whole thing? Anything like that? I just remember on Serial, they talked about how they got the whole file for Adnan's case, and I want that.
So this is a case that like went through the courts and everything. Yeah, so you should. And when did it happen?
90s.
Oh
no, I don't like that face.
Well, so there are retention schedules, so they might not have like the stack, but yeah, I mean, you should be able to go to the court where it happened and ask for, you know the name of like the person. It's the state versus whatever.
Yeah, I have all that information.
Okay, and is it in case search?
It is in case search. It's just I wondered if it was a matter of just going to the clerk's office or if I need to file something.
Well, so you would go, also, sorry, what county?
Baltimore County.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on that? I feel like you're Baltimore County way back.
I do have thoughts on this, and this is not just
Thanks,
this is not just Baltimore County centric. So Danielle's right, there are retention issues, but a lot of these things do not go away. Yeah. So once everything is sort of adjudicated, everything that's in that file, including a lot of the exhibits, they are retained at the courthouse for a couple of years. I think it's 3 to 5, depending on where you're at. And then a lot of times these cases either go to a warehouse or they get sent to the state archives. Mm-hmm. So, okay. But you want to check with the clerk, and they'll be able to tell you. The other thing that you should be aware of is that you may not have everything that the police department acquired on this. Those may or may not be separate records. So you might want to go back to the police department and ask for everything they can release to you. Now that it's not investigatory, it's been adjudicated, you should be able to see everything that they have, provided that they have those records. But I would file a request, or at least talk to the PIO in Baltimore County and ask about that. But then also go to the clerk's office and ask about, what happens to these records once they sort of age out and where they go. They may tell you they're sitting in a warehouse and it could take a week or 2 to find them. That's a hell of a lot better than 30 days.
Yeah, I can deal with that.
And sometimes they might tell you that it's in the state archives. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the state archives are back open for visit yet, but they're really friendly. And if you email them, they usually get back to you pretty quickly, and they can help you out if that's where you end up having to go.
Well, that is so helpful. Thank you.
The reason I groaned for Baltimore County is because they're not on MDEC yet. So they don't have like a digital, it sucks.
Okay.
But yeah, so you should, be able to ask about the physical records, but also, so I don't know what your reasons are for like reinvestigating the homicide, but if there's one side or another that you feel like could be friendlier, you could always ask the prosecutor, the defense for what they have.
And I did want to jump in a little bit on case search because Danielle has brought it up a couple times. With the new sort of over the past couple years, laws around expungement have really taken off in a lot of jurisdictions. And so what we're finding, especially in Maryland right now, is records are being expunged from the public case search. So you will find, just kind of be aware that the record may start to become patchy on those misdemeanors or some of those crimes that are expunged or charges filed. So that's where, you know, the normally the Press Association doesn't weigh in a lot on expungement because, you know, everybody deserves their second chance. We're reporting on a very small segment of the population, but it creates, you know, holes in the historic record. So definitely be aware of that. We see that in DC. Sometimes the automatic expungement, we're starting to see it now in Maryland. Delaware holds its grudges, so I don't think that's going to be an issue for quite some time. But as Delaware has a new wave of progressive legislators, and those things are all up for grabs. And Maryland, of course, is taking a step to the left as well, especially in the House. So I would bring that up. I would draw your attention to the chat where Danielle has provided her email address. Brian has posted his forecast for hell, and Hannah is asking about Montgomery, Prince George's, and Baltimore City were on MDEC. No, everywhere else but those three were on MDEC. Any answers to that question? So it's the big four are not on MDEC.
Yeah,
Can you explain that just a smidge, Danielle?
Sure. So MDEC is the basically digital repository for all the court cases in the state, and every county except for the biggest ones are on MDEC. So Anne Arundel County, you know, your like Worcester, your smaller ones, Calvert, even Howard and Hartford have had their records digitized or are in the process of doing so. But Montgomery, Prince George's, Baltimore City, and Baltimore County, they all are not on MDEC, which makes it really hard to like look at records there. Like I know in Prince George's County, you have to get the case number off of case search and then go stand at the counter while they like bring you your record, and you just have to look at it. Whereas if I were in Anne Arundel County, I could just pop that number into the, you know, the terminal, the computers that they have there, look at everything on the computer. If I want a copy of it, I just print it off. And if I don't, then I'm good. So it's kind of stupid. And the Attorney General earlier this year had, as part of his like landlord-tenant package of legislation he was pushing, had asked for more data accountability. And I asked him, I was like, how are you going to get more data accountability if the biggest jurisdictions in the state aren't on MDEC? And he was like, yeah, that is a good point. That law didn't pass anyway, so.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like we could talk for hours on this, and it's such a rich area to delve into. But Danielle, I am so grateful that you are spending some of your last bits of time in Maryland talking to us about public records. Stay in touch. Thank you all for coming to join us today. As I mentioned, this has been recorded. It'll be on our YouTube channel, along with all of the other things in our Into the Newsroom series. Next week, Larry, do you want to share what your session is going to be about? I'm going to ask you to unmute, Larry.
Yeah, next week we will have a session on the future of journalism. This will be next Wednesday at 9:30, and our panel will include Nancy Karabjanian on the University of Delaware faculty and former anchor with WHYY, and a founder of Delaware Public Media, John Massoni, one of the leaders, head of at WHYY, and Tim Furlong, who is with NBC 10 in Philadelphia, and he is essentially their one-man Delaware bureau. So we're going to talk about the day-to-day operations of the industry, some future trends, collaborative journalism. We're going to kind of cover the waterfront, we hope, and have a pretty good discussion to end the summer for our interns.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. We'll see you all next week, and go out and find public records for your reporting. Right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.